Chapter 5 The prophets speak on the end of days. If there's any one thing that post-biblical prophets have in common beyond the obvious gift of prophecy, it's the fact that they have virtually nothing in common. There's no such thing as a typical prophet, no apparent group God singles out to be recipients of this particular talent, except perhaps a willingness to share their visions with the general public. This chapter, which covers only a tiny cross-section of significant doomsday prophets, includes 3 Russians: a flamboyant seer, a mad monk, and a physician, 2 British authors, a genius mathematician and scientist, and a modest Kentucky photographer. They all have established track records when it comes to the accuracy of their prophecies, and I specifically selected them because I happen to find them particularly fascinating. But you'll notice that even among this small, select group, there's no consensus on the when, how, or even if of the end of days. Edgar Cayce: there are few psychics/prophets/clairvoyants who have fascinated me more, and whose body of work I've found more compelling, than Edgar Cayce. His life began in 1877. He was a Kentucky farm boy whose formal education ended with grammar school. And by the time of his death in 1945, he'd gained unsolicited worldwide renown as the sleeping prophet, accomplishing healings, spiritual and metaphysical dictations, and prophecies while in a deep, self-induced, trance-like sleep, none of which he was able to recall when he was awake. His gifts of prophecy and clairvoyance appeared without warning. Cayce was in his early 20s, making a modest living as a photographer, when an illness caused him to lose his voice. After a year of unsuccessful medical treatments, he took a friend's advice to be treated by a hypnotist. At his first session with a local hypnotist, Cayce suggested that, rather than the hypnotist going to the effort of inducing sleep, it would be more efficient if he put himself to sleep, which he'd discovered years earlier he was able to do with ease. Once he was in a deep trance, Cayce astonished his friend and the hypnotist by launching into a precise description and diagnosis of the condition that had taken his voice away. The grammar school graduate, who was as uninterested in reading as he was in formal education, displayed the anatomical expertise of a skilled physician as he spelled out a list of complex physiological instructions for the hypnotist to give him while he was under. The hypnotist did as he was told, following Cayce's script of suggestions about vocal cords relaxing and arteries opening to restore oxygen and blood to specific paralyzed muscles. And Cayce awoke from that session with his voice fully restored. Word spread quickly about Edgar Cayce's gift for diagnosing and curing illnesses while he slept, and he immediately began receiving letters and personal visits from clients throughout the country wanting his help with illnesses of their own. His initial reaction was to decline their requests. He was uneducated, he argued, and inadequate to be given such awesome responsibility. And the fact that when he was awake he had no memory of the expertise he demonstrated when he was in a trance made it even more impossible to believe that his cures were worth relying on. But the one thing he couldn't argue with was that he'd somehow managed to cure himself, with the hypnotist's help, when the medical community had failed for more than a year. So finally he came to the conclusion that if he indeed had been given this gift, and if he could use it to be of help to suffering people, it would be reprehensible of him not to at least try. Cayce's career of giving physical readings continued throughout his life. His wife, Gertrude, would give him the only information he allowed for each reading, the subject's name, address, and their exact location at the agreed-upon time of the reading. Cayce would ease himself into a trance and signal that he was ready to begin with the words, "Yes, we have the body." Gertrude would read questions to him from the subject's letter, and his secretary, Gladys Davis, would sit nearby, recording the reading in shorthand. One day in 1923, Edgar Cayce, who was still continuing his photography career at that time, happened to meet a printer named Arthur Lammers in the course of his work. Lammers was mesmerized by the world of metaphysics and by Cayce's gift, and he asked for a reading unlike any Cayce had done before, a reading in which, while Cayce was under, Lammers would ask him questions about life, death, the afterlife, the nature of the soul, the future, anything that occurred to him along those spiritually oriented lines, to see what Cayce's sleeping mind would answer. That was the inception of more than 2,000 sessions that came to be called life readings, in which Cayce discussed the metaphysical aspects of his clients' lives and of life in general. The philosophies he offered with profound expertise and depth were completely contrary to his conservative Protestant upbringing, but finally, through these readings, he arrived at an inescapable belief in reincarnation and an awareness that his answers were coming not from him but through him. He was sure he was being given information from the subconscious minds of his subjects, and from the Akashic records, the collective, infinite memories and histories of every thought, moment, word, and event in the eternity of the universe. In his lifetime, Edgar Cayce accomplished more than 14,000 readings, and transcripts of those readings have provided the foundation of more than 300 books about his work. Inevitably, many of those readings involved the future of humankind, of this planet, and of an eventual apocalypse. Cayce predicted a series of natural disasters, wars, economic catastrophes, and great civil unrest, all of which will pave the way for the kingdom of God to rule the earth, with sacred peace and enlightenment thriving throughout humanity. Essential to the prophecies about cataclysmic events was Cayce's belief that these events could be avoided if humankind would only change its ways. Prophecies, he believed, have the potential to be enormously useful if people will respond to them as warnings rather than messages of inevitable, irreversible futility. Edgar Cayce's visions for the future and for the Second Coming include, predicted in the late 1920s, a shift in the Earth's poles around the year 2000, due to changes in the Earth's surface. NASA confirms that in 1998, as polar ice caps melted, ocean currents began flowing toward the equator, which contributed to a continuing change in our planet's magnetic field. If there are greater activities in Vesuvius or Pelee volcanoes than the southern coast of California and the areas between Salt Lake and the southern portions of Nevada, we may expect, within the 3 months following same, inundation by the earthquakes. But these are to be more in the southern than the northern hemisphere. Land will appear in the Atlantic, the lost continent of Atlantis, and the Pacific, the lost continent of Lemuria. And what is the coastline now of many a land will be the bed of the ocean. Even many battlefields of the present will be ocean, will be the seas, the bays, the lands over which the New World Order will carry on their trade as one with another. The earth will be broken up in the western portion of America. The greater portion of Japan must go into the sea. Portions of the now east coast of New York, or New York City itself, will in the main disappear. There will be another generation, though, here, while the southern portions of Carolina, Georgia, these will disappear. Strifes will arise through the period. Watch for them near the Davis Strait, between Greenland and Canada, in the attempts there for the keeping of the lifeline to land open. Watch for them in Libya and in Egypt, in Ankara and in Syria, through the straits above those areas above Australia, in the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. As has been promised through the prophets and the sages, the time of the day of the Lord has been and is being fulfilled in this day and generation. The Lord, then, will come, even as ye have seen him go, Acts 1:11, when those who are his have made the way clear, passable for him to come. He shall come as ye have seen him go, in the body he occupied in Galilee. The body he formed, that was crucified on the cross. Read his promises in that ye have written of his words, he shall rule for 1,000 years. Then shall Satan be loosed again for a season. Revelation 20:6-7, and in the wake of a whole procession of dramatic changes in the earth, some of which we've mentioned here, as we prepare for the second coming of Christ, a new order of conditions is to arise. There must be a purging in high places as well as low, and there must be the greater consideration of the individual, so that each soul is being his brother's keeper. Then certain circumstances will arise in the political, the economic, and a whole relationship to which a leveling will occur, or a greater comprehension of the need for it. This America of ours, hardly a new Atlantis, will have another 1,000 years of peace, another millennium. And then the deeds, the prayers of the faithful, will glorify the Father as peace and love will reign for those who love the Lord. Sir Isaac Newton, the father of modern physics, the discoverer of the theory of gravitation and the theory of optics and probably the greatest mathematical mind in history, Isaac Newton was born on Christmas Day, 1642, in Wool St. Horpe, Lincolnshire, England. His father died 3 months before Isaac's birth, and when Isaac was 3 his mother left him with his grandmother while she moved away to live with her new husband. She returned 8 years later, after which Isaac was sent away to grammar school. While there, he lived with the local apothecary in Grantham, where his fascination with chemicals, and with science in general, took root. At 17 he came home to follow in his late father's footsteps as a farmer. He couldn't have been more of a failure at farming, so instead he made his way to Cambridge, where his genius for mathematics and the sciences became apparent. In fact, his mentor at Cambridge, Isaac Barrow, resigned the prestigious Lucasian professorship so that Isaac Newton could have it instead. Currently, the Lucasian professorship is held by Stephen Hawking. Sir Isaac Newton went on, very famously, to invent everything from the reflecting telescope to calculus, and to permanently change the world's view of everything from astronomy to physics to gravity to motion to mechanics to optics. His book, the Principia Mathematica, is still considered to be the world's greatest scientific work, and it was published only after his friend Edmund Halley happened to learn that Newton had written Part 1 and put it in a drawer 10 years earlier. While he was busily applying his genius to virtually every earthly academic pursuit, he also began applying it to theology, chronology, and the Bible, for which he developed a lifelong passion. He was convinced that Christianity had strayed from the teachings of Jesus and that the Bible is to be read as literal truth. And he became especially fascinated with the end of days as depicted both in Revelation and in the book of Daniel, commonly considered to be the revelation of the Old Testament. His only book about the Bible, published 6 years after his death in 1727, was Observations upon the Prophecies of Daniel and the Apocalypse of St. John, in which he said, the prophecies of Daniel and John should not be understood till the time of the end, but that some should prophesy out of it in an afflicted and mournful state for a long time, and that but darkly, so as to convert but few. But in the very end, the prophecy should be so far interpreted so as to convince many. Then saith Daniel, many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. If the general preaching of the gospel be approaching, it is for us and our posterity that these words mainly belong. In the time of the end the wise shall understand, but none of the wicked shall understand. Blessed is he that readeth, and they that hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things that are written therein. In 1704, Sir Isaac Newton wrote several letters regarding the apocalypse, his mathematical conclusion about when the end of times would come, based on calculations found in unspecified passages in the book of Daniel, and his prediction that the second coming of Christ would follow worldwide epidemics and wars, and that it would precede a 1,000-year reign on earth by the saints themselves. These letters, carefully preserved and collected over these 3 centuries, came into the possession of the Israel National Library in 1969. And in February of 2003 Sir Isaac Newton's official calculation regarding the end of the world, scribbled on a scrap of paper, was revealed to the public for the first time. The year, according to Newton, will be 2060. He added, "It may end later, but I see no reason for its ending sooner. This I mention not to assert when the time of the end shall be, but to put a stop to the rash conjectures of fanciful men who are frequently predicting the time of the end, and by doing so bring the sacred prophecies into discredit as often as their predictions fail." So there you have it. 2060, the date of the end of time, calculated from biblical information by the most brilliant mathematician the world has ever known, to do with as you will. Madame Helena Blavatsky. Madame Helena Blavatsky was a fascinating woman, fearless adventurer, ardent student of the paranormal, sought-after clairvoyant of dubious authenticity, co-founder of the Theosophical Society for the Study of Spiritualism and the Occult Sciences, and author of a book, The Secret Doctrine, that confirmed her skills as a very gifted prophet. Some of her most outspoken critics dismissed her as a complete fraud, while Albert Einstein kept a copy of The Secret Doctrine on his desk. She was born in Russia in 1831. Her father was a soldier, and her mother was a successful novelist. A hint of her peculiar relationship with the truth can be found in the fact that throughout her life she claimed that her mother died when Helena was an infant, even though she was actually 12 years old at the time of her mother's death. Helena was 17 when she escaped a loveless 3-month marriage to a Russian general named Nicephor Blavatsky, who was more than twice her age. She spent the next 10 years traveling. The specifics of those 10 years vary from one account to the next and will never be reliably unraveled. But Helena's version included 2 years of study with the Lama in Tibet, where admittance was not easily granted in the 1800s, particularly to women. She finally returned to Russia and to her husband, on the condition that she be required to spend only a minimal amount of time with him. She began holding séances in her grandfather's home, quickly attracting a cross-section of Russian intellectuals who were becoming increasingly intrigued by the paranormal, and by Madame Helena Blavatsky. Her appeal obviously wasn't limited to her skills as a clairvoyant, since over the next few years she was romantically involved with an Estonian spiritualist and a married opera singer while still living with her husband. She gave birth to a son, Yuri, who was deformed at birth, and none of her lovers claimed paternity. His death at the age of 5 devastated her and, she once wrote, destroyed her belief in the Russian Orthodox God. She held on to some of her faith, though, as evidenced in a subsequent statement that there were moments when I believed deeply that the blood of Christ had redeemed me. Money and clients for her occult pursuits were diminishing, so Helena decided to travel again, this time to Odessa, to Egypt, and to Paris, where she heard about the spiritualist movement that was gaining momentum in the United States. Sure that this was the new beginning she'd been searching for, she boarded a steamship for New York City, arriving in July of 1873 with little more than a dime to her name. She struggled for more than a year, barely making ends meet with occasional séances and her job at a sweatshop. But then, in October of 1974, her life changed dramatically when she traveled to a remote farm in Vermont for the sole purpose of introducing herself to Colonel Henry Steele Olcott. Colonel Olcott was writing a series of research articles on a pair of brothers who were conducting séances at the farm, and Helena decided he was someone she wanted and needed to meet. She stayed at the farm for 10 days, conducting séances with the Eddy brothers and making a very positive impression on Colonel Olcott. He wrote several articles about her and was delighted when she offered to translate them for publication in Russia. Thanks to those articles and word of mouth, Madame Helena Blavatsky's fame began to spread throughout and beyond New York. Of far more significance, her relationship with Colonel Olcott blossomed into the founding of the Theosophical Society in 1875, an organization that emphasizes cultural understanding between Eastern and Western philosophies, religions, and sciences, and that continues to thrive today. Adding more controversy to an already controversial life, she began claiming the appearance of a parade of manifested spirits during séances. An infamous photograph was taken of Madame Blavatsky seated in front of 3 of these manifested spirits, whom she called her ascended masters, her personal master, Elmira, Saint Germain, draped in an ermine cloak, and her teacher, Kuthumi, through whom she claimed to have channeled much of her written work, including the Secret Doctrine. With or without the help of ascended master Kuthumi, Helena Blavatsky wrote the Secret Doctrine in 1888, and there's no denying the accuracy of many of the prophecies recorded in that book. For example, between 1888 and 1897 there will be a large rent made in the veil of nature, and materialistic science will receive a death blow. Materialistic science referred to scientists' view at the time that the world was composed of nothing more than its material, visible, and tangible elements. That short-sighted view changed forever when, in 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays, exposing a whole new universe of realities beyond the naked eye, and, in 1896, when Antoine Becquerel discovered radioactivity. The Secret Doctrine also included facts about the realities of energy that were contrary to the beliefs of the majority of scientists in the 1800s but came about after Helena Blavatsky committed them to paper in 1888. To name a few, she announced that atoms could be divided. 11 years later, in 1897, Sir J.J. Thomson discovered the electron. Atoms are perpetually in motion. 12 years later, in 1900, Max Planck's work laid the foundation for the quantum theory of physics. Matter and energy can be converted. 17 years later, in 1905, Albert Einstein unveiled the theory of relativity. Her prophecies inevitably extended to the Earth and its geographical and spiritual future. She believed strongly, for example, that the lost continents of Atlantis and Lemuria would re-emerge, and added, the elevated ridge in the Atlantic Basin, 9,000 feet in height, which runs from a point near the British Islands, first slopes towards South America, then shifts almost at right angles to proceed in a southeasterly line toward the African coast. This ridge is a remnant of an Atlantic continent. Could it be traced further, it would establish the reality of a submarine horseshoe junction with a former continent in the Indian Ocean. An impenetrable veil of secrecy was thrown over the occult and religious mysteries taught there, after the submersion of the last remnant of the Atlantean race, some 12,000 years ago. In March of 1996, Discover magazine published satellite photographs of the areas she described more than a century earlier. Discover explained the photographs as follows: the mid-Atlantic ridge snakes down the center of that ocean off Greenland to the latitude of Cape Horn. Under South Africa, the southwest Indian ridge shoots into the Indian Ocean like a fizzling rocket, or perhaps like the trail of some giant and cartoonish deep-sea mole. Years earlier, in 1954, the Geological Society of America Bulletin reported on an exploration of the summit of this same mid-Atlantic ridge. The state of lithification of the limestone suggests that it may have been lithified under subaerial, i.e., above water, on land surface conditions, and that the seamount summit may have been an island within the past 12,000 years. Expanding her prophecies to other parts of the world, Helena Blavatsky also wrote in The Secret Doctrine, England is on the eve of such or another catastrophe, France, nearing such a point of her cycle, and Europe in general threatened with, or rather, on the eve of a cataclysm. A world destruction as happened to Atlantis will occur. Instead of Atlantis, all of England and parts of the northwest European coast will sink into the sea. In contrast, the sunken Azores region, the Isle of Poseidonis, will again be raised from the sea. The Isle of Poseidonis is thought to be an island approximately the size of Ireland that is a remnant of Atlantis. As cataclysmic as some of Madame Blavatsky's geological predictions were, her prophecy for the ultimate non-physical future of our planet was optimistic. We are at the close of the cycle of 5,000 years of the present Aryan Kali Yuga or Dark Age. This will be succeeded by an age of light. Even now under our very eyes, the new race or races are preparing to be formed, and that is in America that the transformation will take place, and has already silently commenced. This race will be altered in mentality and will move toward a more perfect spiritual existence. H. G. Wells. A discussion about what lies ahead for us and our planet would seem incomplete without acknowledging a prolific author and social activist who came to be known as the man who invented tomorrow. Herbert George Wells was born in Bromley, Kent, England, on September 21, 1866. His parents were hard-working blue-collar people, which purely by chance provided Wells with a wealth of access to his childhood passion, books. His mother was a housekeeper at an estate near the Wells home, and he went with her at every opportunity to sneak into the mansion's vast library and read until his mother had finished her work. Out of family necessity, the young Herbert George's school years were interrupted by a job as a draper's apprentice. When he returned to school, he focused his studies on the sciences, received his bachelor's degree, and taught school until, in 1893, he began writing full-time. In the meantime, Wells was launching what can politely be described as a colorful personal life. In 1891, the year after he graduated from college, he married his cousin Isabel. To support both his wife and his parents, he worked 2 jobs and was rewarded with a case of tuberculosis. He then left Isabel for one of his students, a young woman named Amy Catherine Robbins, whom he married in 1895 and with whom he had the only 2 legitimate children of the 7 he ultimately fathered. Fortunately for the literary world, Wells also channeled his passion into his first book, The Time Machine, the story of a man returning from a trip to the year 800 and 2701. It's a fascinating combination of parody and dark science fiction. But the technical principles and details of The Time Machine itself exposed Wells's unanticipated foresights into non-fiction science and physics. The Time Machine, for example, alluded to a time-space continuum years before Einstein published his theory on that same subject. As his literary success grew, with such science fiction groundbreakers as The War of the Worlds and The Island of Dr. Moreau, his reputation as a conflicted, outspoken, and often radical social commentator grew as well. He championed the lower classes and so passionately believed in a fair and equal community of humankind that he joined a London socialist organisation called the Fabian Society. But he and its leaders, particularly author George Bernard Shaw, quarrelled constantly, and Wells used his contentious relationship with the Fabian Society as the basis for his novel The New Machiavelli. H. G. Wells was also a passionate believer that, no matter how bleak it might seem because of man's inhumanity to man, the future was still very much worth fighting for. That basic theme inspired a prolific array of non-fiction work, including The Outline of History, which was the 20th century's second bestseller. His articulate insights led to his membership on the Research Committee for the League of Nations, meetings with Lenin, Stalin, and Franklin Roosevelt, and a candidacy for the British Parliament. By the time of his death on August 13, 1946, H. G. Wells had written more than 100 books, only about half of them fictional, and he had predicted all of the following on paper, years before each of them became a reality: the atomic bomb, England's entering the Second World War in 1940, the London Blitz, the military vehicle we know as the tank, the military use of airplanes, superhighways, computers, urban overcrowding, uranium bombs, VCRs, television sets, on which news would be broadcast. H. G. Wells was subject to depression, darkness, and pessimism. The epitaph he wrote for himself read, "God damn you all, I told you so," which frankly makes his view of the world's potential for endless longevity all the more surprising and touching. He genuinely believed that if humankind would transcend its self-destructive behavior, he envisioned an indestructible world of peace, cooperation, and freedom from habitual hatreds, bigotry, and class consciousness by the middle of the 21st century. Whether or not this planet survives, and we humans survive on it, in other words, is completely our choice and our responsibility. Grigory Rasputin. I said at the beginning of this chapter that there's no such thing as a typical prophet and that God endows the gift of prophecy to a wide variety of people. Grigory Rasputin is a perfect example of that wide variety. He was born in 1872 in the small Siberian village of Pokrovskoye. His parents, both peasants, were devoutly religious, and Grigory's father, Efim, read the Bible to his family every night, a practice that influenced Rasputin throughout his life. He was prone to depression as a child, particularly when, at the age of 8, he lost his older brother to pneumonia. By his mid-teens he'd already gained a reputation as what we'd now call a juvenile delinquent. He drank heavily, he was wildly reckless, and he found the young girls of Pokrovskoye as irresistible as they found him. He also gained a childhood reputation as a psychic. The story goes that one night he was lying in bed when he overheard his father and a group of house guests talking about the theft of a horse and theorizing about possible suspects. Grigory walked into the room, identified one of the men as the horse thief, and went back to bed. The group chuckled at the little boy's accusation and went on with their evening. But later, two of the guests followed the accused man home and were shocked to find the stolen horse hidden in an outbuilding. Rasputin's marriage at 19 did nothing to calm him down or put an end to his drinking, and there's a certain irony in the fact that he was accused, but not convicted, of stealing horses. He was sentenced to banishment from Pokrovskoye, but he convinced the court to allow him an alternative to banishment. He suggested he take his father's place on a pilgrimage to the Verkhoturye monastery more than 200 miles away. The court agreed, and Rasputin gladly accepted what he thought was a comparative slap on the wrist. He was preparing to leave for the monastery when his wife lost their first son. He had no choice but to proceed with his journey, but it was a long, sad, lonely trek. Shortly after he arrived at Verkhoturye, Rasputin had the honor of meeting a devout, widely respected recluse named Makary, who told him that the tragic death of his son was a divine message to return to Pokrovskoye and devote his life to God. Rasputin did exactly that, almost shocking the village with his newfound piety. He stopped drinking, and he spent hours and hours of every day in prayer. As luck would have it, though, his pilgrimage to the Verkhoturye monastery had also exposed him to a relatively obscure Russian Orthodox sect, called Skoptsi, with an approach to their faith that was more compatible with Rasputin's nature. They believed that sin was an essential element in the connection between humankind and God. Without sin there could be no confession. Without confession there could be no forgiveness. And without forgiveness there could be no God-given cleansing of the soul. It made perfect, convenient sense to Rasputin, and he became a Skoptsi monk, sinning his way through widespread travels as an impressive, well-educated, well-spoken, and intensely charismatic religious teacher. Rasputin was so impressive, in fact, that in 1903, when he made his first visit to St. Petersburg, he quickly began attracting the upper-class residents. His exhaustive knowledge of the scriptures, his facile talent as a storyteller, and his darkly mysterious charisma combined with rumors of his supernatural powers, which by now were said to include both psychic abilities and the gift of healing, made him irresistible to St. Petersburg society. It was on his return trip to the city in 1905 that he was invited to the home of Grand Duke Peter Nikolaevich and Grand Duchess Militsa, who regarded him as a devout man whom God had blessed with great unearthly powers. Rasputin was given the perfect opportunity to confirm their belief in him when they led him to their beloved dog, who was very ill and had been given only a few months to live. He knelt beside the dog and began to pray, and by all accounts the dog slowly but surely regained its health. The dog lived for years after Rasputin's healing, and Rasputin's reputation as a truly gifted man of God was etched in stone. The Grand Duke and Duchess eagerly introduced Rasputin to their friends Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra. Even though he didn't demonstrate any of his supernatural powers in their first few meetings, Rasputin made a significant impact on the Tsar and Tsarina, such a significant impact, in fact, that the Tsar began referring to Rasputin as the Holy Man. His impact on the Tsarina was undoubtedly amplified by the fact that her previous advisor, Dr. Philip, had assured her when he left that Your Majesty will someday have another friend like me who will speak to you of God. Alexandra was quick to assume that Rasputin was that friend she'd been looking for. In 1905 Nicholas and Alexandra, after having been blessed with 4 daughters, ecstatically welcomed a son and heir to the throne, Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich. His birth was celebrated by all of Russia, while the Tsar and Tsarina kept the heartbreaking secret they'd learned shortly after Alexei was born. He was afflicted with hemophilia, which made him a fragile, sickly child who could never ascend to the Russian throne if he were considered to be physically unfit. Rasputin was summoned by Nicholas and Alexandra several times during Alexei's childhood, and he was undeniably remarkable at easing Alexei's discomfort. Possibly the most renowned event in the relationship between Rasputin and this frail little boy was recorded by his older sister, Olga. The poor child lay in pain, dark patches under his eyes and his little body all distorted, and the injured leg terribly swollen. The doctors were just useless, more frightened than any of us. Alexandra sent a message to Rasputin in St. Petersburg. He reached the palace about midnight. Early in the morning Alexandra called me to go Alexei's room. I just could not believe my eyes. The little boy was not just alive, but well. He was sitting up in bed, the fever gone, the eyes clear and bright, not a sign of any swelling in the leg. Later I learned that Rasputin had not even touched the child but merely stood at the foot of the bed and prayed. Needless to say, that miracle secured Rasputin's status with the royal family. Nicholas and Alexandra embraced him gratefully and wholeheartedly and, some would say, blindly. Rasputin, celebrated as he was, had never abandoned his devout belief that sin was the only true path to God. And now, with his own bedroom in the palace, he practiced that belief with the added bonuses of an expensive wardrobe and his virtual pick of the local females, whom he purified on a very regular basis. Even Nicholas and Alexandra's daughters weren't off limits in his eyes. While no one has ever suggested that there was any actual sexual contact between Rasputin and the Tsarevnas, he was found in their rooms frequently enough that their governess strongly suggested to Alexandra that he be permanently barred from the girls' bedroom. It speaks volumes about the extent of his influence over Alexandra that, rather than heeding the governess's advice, she defended Rasputin's right to move freely throughout the palace without restrictions. Predictably, Rasputin's influence over Nicholas and Alexandra was beginning to alarm an increasing number of people, from the Russian Orthodox Church to the Grand Duke and Duchess who'd introduced Rasputin to the royal family. The Church conducted an investigation that resulted in devastating evidence against him from countless women, including the attempted rape of a nun. The Tsar and Tsarina were confronted with a long list of Rasputin's crimes, both proven and alleged, and they tragically refused to listen. Alexandra in particular took the position that the rising tide against Rasputin was the result of nothing but cruel jealousy and resentment because we love him. World War I was raging, and in 1915 Nicholas traveled to take command of the troops on the Eastern Front. Whether or not this was Rasputin's idea is a matter of debate, but there's no doubt about the effect of Nicholas's decision. His absence left Tsarina Alexandra as the sole ruler of Russia, which essentially left Rasputin in a position of great power and influence over her and, as a result, the entire country. Among his first priorities was the removal of his detractors from positions of significance within the government, replacing them with his proven loyalists. To this day it's a widely held belief that Rasputin, and Alexandra's almost slavish reliance on his advice, was directly responsible for the loss of confidence in the imperial government. It was decided by a growing number of Rasputin's enemies, both outside and within the government, that he had to be eliminated. He wasn't about to step aside, nor was the Tsarina about to allow it. And so, on the night of December 16, 1916, Rasputin was invited to the home of Prince Felix Yusupov for the ostensible purpose of meeting Yusupov's wife, Irina. The evening proved to be an odd testament to Rasputin's power. He unwittingly ate his share of cakes laced with poison and drank his share of alcohol laced with poison. To Yusupov's and his fellow conspirators' irritation, neither had the slightest effect on Rasputin, so Yusupov resorted to shooting him in the back. Rasputin fell to the floor. Yusupov bent over him to make sure he was dead, at which moment Rasputin leaped up and attacked Yusupov. Yusupov managed to escape Rasputin and shoot 4 more bullets at him, one of those shots hitting Rasputin in the head. For good measure, Yusupov then proceeded to beat Rasputin with a club until there was no more movement or sound coming from him. Yusupov and his fellow conspirators wrapped Rasputin's body in a curtain and threw it into the Neva River. Incredibly, the death was listed as a drowning, since water in Rasputin's lungs established that he was still breathing when he was dropped into the dark river. It was later discovered that in December of 1916 Rasputin wrote a letter to Tsarina Alexandra predicting that he would be murdered before the 1st of January, 1917. He then added, "If I am killed by common assassins, then you have nothing to fear. But if I am murdered by nobles, and if they shed my blood, their hands will remain soiled. Brothers will kill brothers and there will be no nobles in the country." The remainder of the letter clarified Rasputin's prophecy: if he was murdered by the poor, the royal family would prosper. But if he was killed at the hands of princes, the Tsarina and her entire family would be assassinated in less than 2 years. A year and a half after the death of Rasputin at the hands of princes, Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children were executed by Bolshevik guards on July 16, 1918. It is no surprise that the controversy surrounding the life of Rasputin, who came to be known as the Mad Monk, continues to this day. There are those who believe that despite his fairly despicable personal behavior, he was a genuinely gifted healer and psychic, a prophetic advisor to Tsarina Alexandra who indisputably saved Alexei's life. Others argue just as passionately that Rasputin was a con artist and fraud who used his charisma and talent for hypnosis to endear himself to the most powerful family in Russia and create the illusion of healing in a sick, highly suggestible young boy. Wherever the truth lies, many of his prophecies have survived since the middle of the First World War, including this one involving his vision of the coming apocalypse: mankind is going in the direction of the catastrophe. The less able ones will be guiding the car. This will happen in Russia, in France, in Italy, and in other places. The humanity will be squashed by the lunatic's roar. The wisdom will be chained. The ignorant and the prepotent will dictate the laws to the wise and to the humble person. So, most of the humanity will believe in the powerful ones and no more in God. The punishment of God will arrive late, but it will be tremendous. And it will arrive before our century ends. Then, finally the wisdom will be free from the chains and the man will return entirely to God, as the baby who goes to his mother. In this way, mankind will arrive on the terrestrial paradise. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle created the character of Sherlock Holmes, about whom he wrote 4 novels and 56 short stories. He was a successful physician who served in a medical unit in South Africa. He was knighted by King Edward VII for an article he wrote entitled "The War in South Africa, Its Cause and Conduct," in which he defended England's handling of the Boer War. He became a renowned writer and public speaker on spiritualism and the afterlife. and he committed to paper in 1930 a list of prophecies that history showed to be remarkably accurate. His name was Arthur Conan Doyle, and he was born to devoutly Catholic parents in Edinburgh, Scotland, on May 22, 1859. His early career as a physician led him to his wife, Louise, whose brother Jack he treated for terminal cerebral meningitis. Jack's illness and death drew Arthur and Louise into a deeply devoted, respectful marriage that resulted in the birth of 2 children, at a time when Arthur was making the transition from successful physician to brilliantly gifted author. The first Sherlock Holmes story was published in 1887. In 1893, Louise was diagnosed with tuberculosis. Arthur moved the family to the healthier climate of Hindhead, Surrey, England, in 1897, and it was there that he met the love of his life, a woman named Jean Lecky. For almost 10 years, Arthur Conan Doyle and Jean Lecky somehow managed to carry on an affair that was both passionate and platonic, and Arthur never violated his oath that Louise was never to know about Jean and was never ever to be hurt. Louise died in 1906, and for quite some time Arthur sank into health problems and depression, struggling with the guilt of a decade of secret keeping and withholding from a wife who'd devoted her life to him. But the love between him and Jean survived, and they were married in the fall of 1907. In 1881, Arthur Conan Doyle happened to attend a lecture on spiritualism rather remarkable under the circumstances, since his childhood Catholicism had dissipated into agnosticism by then. Something clearly moved his soul at that lecture, though, and didn't let go. He began writing articles for spiritualist publications. He attended séances. He volunteered to be hypnotized at a lecture on mesmerism, the study of animal magnetism, in vogue at that time. And finally, in 1893, he joined the British Society for Psychical Research, an organization that, among other things, investigated alleged hauntings and similar paranormal phenomena. By 1920, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was one of England's and America's foremost writers and public speakers on the subjects of spiritualism and the afterlife. It was a courageous undertaking on his part, because he accurately assumed it would compromise his lifetime of credibility. But his spiritual convictions were so strong and so deep in him that he willingly paid that price without equivocation or apologies until the day he died of heart failure on July 7, 1930. A man as open-minded, diverse, and spiritually available as Arthur Conan Doyle was a perfect channel for prophecies. Some of them came from his spirit guide Phineas, and some of them were based on material he'd gleaned from mediums throughout England and the United States. All of them were contained in a letter he wrote shortly before his death, almost an open letter to humankind out of heartfelt concern, intended not to frighten but simply to encourage vigilance and preparation. In 1930, Arthur Conan Doyle predicted that a period of natural convulsions will take place during which a large portion of the human race will perish. Earthquakes of great severity and enormous tidal waves would seem to be the agent. War will appear only in the early stages and will appear to be a signal for the crisis to follow. The crisis will come in an instant. The destruction and dislocation of civilized life will be beyond belief. There will be a short period of chaos followed by some reconstruction. The total period of upheavals will be roughly 3 years. The chief centers of disturbance will be the eastern Mediterranean basin, where not less than 5 countries will entirely disappear. In the Atlantic there will be a rise of land which will be a cause of those waves which will bring about great disasters upon the Americas, the Irish and Western European shores, involving all of the low-lying British coasts. Further great upheavals would occur in the southern Pacific and in the Japanese region. Mankind can be saved by returning to its spiritual values. Nostradamus Michel de Nostradam, aka Nostradamus, was born in Saint-Rémy de Provence, France, in 1503. More than 500 years later his prophecies are still being exhaustively studied, debated, praised, and decried, and the man himself is the subject of both great admiration as a prophet and equally great disdain as a fraud. I will never claim to be an expert on the subject of Nostradamus, but I do know that in his early years he was a brilliant physician and alchemist. He worked tirelessly to heal countless victims of a plague that swept through France not long after he received his degree in medicine from the University of Montpellier, and the herbal medications he created were so effective in curing the incurable that he was accused of being a heretic, a deadly charge at the time. No less than the Pope himself declared the charges unfounded after hearing of Nostradamus's undeniable success against the plague. Nostradamus was known for his lifelong generosity toward the poor. Nostradamus spent 4 years writing his first book of prophecies, called The Centuries, but was reluctant to publish it for fear of the cruel religious persecution prevalent against seers and soothsayers of that era. Finally, though, he felt too strongly that his book might be of use to society to keep it hidden, and he published it in 1555 at his own very real peril. Last but not least, Nostradamus took no personal credit for his prophecies but instead acknowledged God as their author and as the one from whom he received his gift. As he wrote in the preface of his first book of prophecies, which he dedicated to his son, "Thy late arrival, my son, has made me bestow much time, through nightly vigils, to leave you in writing a memorial to refer to that might serve for the common profit of mankind, out of what the divine being has permitted me to learn from the revolution of the stars." So whether or not his prophecies were or are considered accurate, it's hard to imagine that a man of his kindness, faith, humility, and selflessness would deliberately perpetrate a fraud. Tragically, the same plague Nostradamus fought against so successfully killed his wife and 2 children, and he spent the next several years as a traveling physician. It was during these long, lonely years that he began actively studying and experimenting with the occult, for which he held a lifelong fascination. It was also on one of his routine journeys between France and Italy that he had what is considered to be his first prophetic experience. He was on a narrow footpath in Italy when he came upon a small group of Franciscan monks. Nostradamus was of Jewish lineage, but his family had converted to Christianity, and he was raised in the Catholic faith. So, like any respectful Catholic, he began stepping aside to let the monks pass. But suddenly he focused on one of them and, overcome with awe, he fell to his knees and genuflected at the feet of Father Felice Peretti, a swineherd, before he entered the monastery. When the astonished monk asked what on earth Nostradamus was doing, he replied, "I must yield myself and bow before His Holiness." 19 years after the death of Nostradamus, that monk, Father Peretti, became Pope Sixtus V. When Nostradamus's travels ended, he remarried, this time to a wealthy widow with whom he had 6 children. They settled in Ceylon, France, and it was there that he began his prophetic writings. His works had a very distinctive structure. He wrote in 4-line verses, or quatrains. Then he organized the quatrains into what he called centuries, 100 quatrains per century, although since he wrote a total of 942 quatrains in his lifetime, there was one century that contained only 42 quatrains. As for his style, it can only be described as obscure. It was full of Greek and Latin and anagrams and odd, complicated plays on words. One school of thought is that his writings were deliberately vague so that they would be too hard to interpret for anyone to claim he was inaccurate. The truth is actually a distant relative of that theory. Nostradamus knew that he faced possible persecution, including torture or death, if he clearly revealed himself as a prophet. But if his works were obscure and confusing enough, no one could make an ironclad case against him for being a heretic seer in league with the devil. So the fact that debates continue to this day about the real interpretation of the Nostradamus quatrains is a testament to his ability to protect himself and the integrity of his prophecies. It was one of Nostradamus's less obscure quatrains that put him in great favor with the French royal family and elevated his status during his lifetime. The quatrain reads, "The young lion will overcome the older one on the field of combat and single battle. He will pierce his eyes through a golden cage, 2 wounds made 1, then he dies a cruel death." A few short years after Nostradamus wrote those words, France's King Henry II was killed during a jousting tournament when his opponent's lance slipped through the golden face mask of the king's helmet, piercing his eye. King Henry's wife, Catherine de' Medici, knew of Nostradamus's prophecy about her husband, and after his death she regularly used Nostradamus as her personal consultant. The prophecies of Nostradamus have been translated, dissected, analyzed, and interpreted by countless people in countless books, articles, and films. I can't possibly do them justice here. But for the purpose of our discussion of the apocalypse, there are several quatrains that lend themselves perfectly. Nostradamus predicted that on the long road to the end of days, the world would see a rise to power of 3 antichrists who would terrorize and sadistically brutalize anyone who offered them less than blind, slavish loyalty. His description of the first of these antichrists reads, "An emperor shall be born near Italy who shall cost the empire dear. They shall say, with what people he keeps company, he shall be found less a prince than a butcher. From a simple soldier he will rise to the empire, from the short robe he will attain the long. Great swarms of bees shall arise." And, in a separate quatrain, the captive prince, conquered, is sent to Elba, he will sail across the Gulf of Genoa to Marseilles. By a great effort of the foreign forces he is overcome, though he escaped the fire, his bees yield blood by the barrel. The identity of Nostradamus's first Antichrist seems indisputable to his countless students and fans. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France from 1799 to 1814, was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, 50 miles from the coast of Italy. No one would disagree with the description of him as a butcher throughout his reign. And, for good measure, his imperial crest was the symbol of the beehive. Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba but escaped for 100 days. After a defeat at Waterloo he relinquished all power and was exiled to the tiny island of St. Helena. The second Antichrist was described by Nostradamus as a great enemy of the human race and a master manipulator. Out of the deepest part of the west of Europe, from poor people a young child shall be born, who with his tongue shall seduce many people. His fame shall increase in the eastern kingdom. He shall come to tyrannize the land. He shall raise up a hatred that had long been dormant. The child of Germany observes no law. Cries and tears, fire, blood, and battle. In a separate quatrain Nostradamus adds, a captain of Germany shall come to yield himself by false hope, so that his revolt shall cause great bloodshed. Beasts wild with hunger will cross the rivers, the greater part of the battlefield will be against Hitler. It's no surprise that this is widely believed to be Nostradamus's prophecy of the rise of Adolf Hitler, who was born in Austria in 1889 to a poor family. References like tyrannized and raised up a hatred and observed no law and seducing many people with his tongue are understatements to describe the psychopathic, sadistic, inhuman monster that child of Germany proved to be. However, critics of Nostradamus's works are quick to point out that Hitler, rather than being an uncanny reference to Hitler that was just one letter off, happened to be the name of the lower Danube River during Nostradamus's time. This is one of countless quatrains in which the debate over the true interpretation isn't likely to end. As for the third Antichrist, Nostradamus was again both very descriptive and subject to exhaustive debate. Out of the country of Greater Arabia shall be born a strong master of Muhammad. He will enter Europe wearing a blue turban. He will be the terror of mankind. From the sky will come the great king of terror. He will bring back to life the king of the Mongols, before and after war reigns. The sky will burn at 45 degrees. Fire approaches the great new city. By fire he will destroy their city, a cold and cruel heart, blood will pour, mercy to none. Before September 11, 2001, it was widely accepted that the Great New City was a reference to New York City, with the words "the sky will burn at 45 degrees" referring to New York's location near 45 degrees latitude. After September 11, 2001, the obvious reference in Nostradamus's prophecy was to the World Trade Center, consumed in flames, burning so high in the air before the towers collapsed that the flames were at a 45-degree angle to the horizon. Which brings up an important point about Nostradamus and virtually every other prophet in history: their prophecies have to be put in the context of the times in which they were said or written. For example, one of Nostradamus's most widely quoted quatrains in discussions about his doomsday prophecies reads, "In the year 1999 and 7 months the great king of terror will come from the sky. He will bring back Genghis Khan before and after war rules happily." Obviously, Nostradamus scholars are still having a field day interpreting who or what the great king of terror was, especially those who believe it was an obvious reference to a fourth Antichrist, or a precursor to the Antichrist, as John the Baptist was to Jesus. To the skeptics who say, "You see, no such thing happened in 1999, the believers reply, "How do you know he just hasn't revealed himself yet?" As for the year 1999 and 7 months, many Nostradamus scholars point out that that date shouldn't be taken too literally. Nostradamus lived in an age when people believed strongly in a correlation between world-altering events and the turn of the millennia. And let's face it, after the hysteria of the transition to the year 2000, we haven't exactly outgrown that belief ourselves. So it's possible that Nostradamus saw a vague date in the distant future for that particular prophecy and, because the prophecy involved an event of great global enormity, he assumed that it would happen in close proximity to the dawn of a new millennium. There are a number of quatrains that are thought to be Nostradamus's prophecies leading to the end of the world. To quote just a few, after a great misery for mankind an even greater approach as the great cycle of the centuries is renewed. It will rain blood, milk, famine, war, and disease. In the sky will be seen a fire, dragging a tail of sparks. The sun in 20 degrees Taurus there will be a great earthquake, the great theatre full up will be ruined. Darkness and trouble in the air, on the sky and land, when the infidel calls upon God and the saints. Saturn joined with Scorpio transiting toward Sagittarius, at its highest ascendant, pest, famine, death through military hand, the century as well as the age approaches its renewal. At a latitude of 48 degrees at the end of Cancer there is a very great drought. Fish in the sea, river, and lake boiled hectic, southern France in distress from fire in the sky. In the year when Saturn and Mars are equally fiery, the air is very dry, a long comet. From hidden fires a great place burns with heat, little rain, hot wind, wars, and raids. The great mountain, 4,247 feet in circumference, after peace, war, famine, and flooding will spread far, drowning great countries even antiquities and their mighty foundations. You will see, sooner and later, great changes made, extreme horrors and vengeances, for as the moon is thus led by its angel, the heavens draw near to the reckoning. And finally, the quatrain that may give comfort to anyone who's wondering if they should start putting their affairs in order before the end of days arrives, 20 years the reign of the moon shall pass. After 7,000 years another similar monarchy shall tenure. When the sun shall take hold of its remaining days, then my prophecy shall be finished. Nostradamus calculated that human history began in 3203 BC. Add 7,000 years to that date and you arrive at the conclusion that Nostradamus predicted this planet will come to an end in the year AD 3797. The last prophecy of Nostradamus is found in the following quatrain: on returning from an embassy, the king's gift safely stored, no more will I labor, for I will have gone to God by my close relatives, friends, and blood brothers, I shall be found dead, near my bed and the bench. On the night before his death, Nostradamus, who'd just returned from a trip to an embassy, called for a priest to give him last rites. The priest commented that Nostradamus seemed perfectly healthy to him. But Nostradamus assured him, "You will not see me alive at sunrise." The next morning, on July 2, 1566, Nostradamus's family found him dead, lying between the bed and his bedside bench. Contemporary prophets weigh in 1970, born-again fundamentalist Hal Lindsey published a book called The Late Great Planet Earth. Among his predictions in that book, all based on his interpretation of the Bible, particularly the books of Daniel and Revelation, were that Christ would physically return to Earth no later than 1988, that the United States would not be a significant geopolitical power by the time of the apocalyptic tribulations, and that there would be a 10-member United States of Europe that would evolve into a revived Roman Empire ruled by the Antichrist. The timing of the book's publication undoubtedly contributed to its immediate success and fueled a renewed belief in the imminent end of days. The world's memory was still fresh of the 1967 Six-Day War, the armed conflict between Israel and the Arab states of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. In 6 days, Israel conquered the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, and Golan Heights, which became collectively known as the Occupied Territories. Just as sales of the Bible skyrocketed after the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, the Six-Day War heightened the urgency of that search for the truth about when this planet's story will end. But the late great planet Earth is still in print, has sold more than 35 million copies and has been published in more than 54 languages, so it's not as if its popularity is just a passing whim. Obviously the 1988 prediction was inaccurate, but Lindsay continues to believe that the Apostle John, credited with writing the Book of Revelation, was an actual eyewitness to events of the 20th and 21st centuries. On a 1997 television appearance on Fox News, he said, "The prophet John who wrote the Book of the Revelation says, I looked, I saw, and heard." A first-century man was propelled up to the end of the 20th century and he actually saw a war of technical marvel. An intercontinental ballistic missile warhead re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, poison water, radioactivity, every city on Earth virtually destroyed. I've read the Book of Revelation more times than I can begin to count, and I reread it when I heard that declaration. I know Revelation is rumored to be a series of encoded symbols, but I can't find even a hint of what Hal Lindsey was referring to. Of course, to be fair, Lindsey's position is that only a Christian guided by the Spirit of God can accurately interpret the symbols in Revelation, so apparently the presumption is that those of us who have a whole different take on Revelation are simply misguided. And then there are the Left Behind books, written by Baptist preachers Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins. This series about the Second Coming of Christ has sold over 65 million copies, and the essential message is that the physical return of Jesus is quickly approaching. Their view is that the Earth's demise is quickly approaching too. According to LaHaye, we have more reason to believe that ours may be the terminal generation than any generation since Jesus founded his church 2,000 years ago. The Left Behind series takes the position that what will cause the end of civilization is a worldwide conspiracy of secret societies and liberal groups whose purpose is to destroy every vestige of Christianity. Co-conspirators include the ACLU, the NAACP, Planned Parenthood, the National Organization for Women, major television networks, magazines, and newspapers, the U.S. State Department, the Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the United Nations, Harvard, Yale, 2,000 other colleges and universities, and, last but not least, the left wing of the Democratic Party. If these united organizations and societies have their way, according to LaHaye and Jenkins, they will turn America into an amoral, humanist country, ripe for merger into a one-world socialist state. Sadly, nothing in the Left Behind series suggests that there's any point in attending to the people and environment of our planet, seemingly because a literal interpretation of the Bible doesn't propose any such altruism as the end of days approaches. Is it me, or does that seem completely contrary to what Jesus had in mind? There's Arnold Murray of Arkansas's Shepherd's Chapel, who predicted in the mid-1970s that the Antichrist would appear before 1981 and that the War of Armageddon would start in June of 1985, and Pat Robertson, who saw the world ending in the autumn of 1982, and Moses David of a group called the Children of God, with his prediction that the real Battle of Armageddon would result in a defeat of both Israel and the United States by Russia in 1986, after which a global communist dictatorship would be established and Christ would return to Earth in 1993, and Edgar C. Whisenant, who, in 1988, published a book called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Could Be in 1988, and Baptist minister Peter Ruckman, whose analysis of the Bible resulted in his certainty that the rapture would happen sometime around 1990. The list goes on and on, and on, and on, proving, if nothing else, that the passionate pursuit of the truth about the end of days is likely to continue until the end of days itself.